Good Sabbath, everyone. Uh, some of you may know me, and I would like to introduce myself a little bit so you have an idea who in the world is talking here today. I'm bringing this sermon. I started coming to church as a college student, first generation, many decades ago. Never thought that I would be sitting before you today, but I'm an economist by education. I've been in big business, small business, uh, around the country. Have attended, lived in 6 states and lived in 9 congregations over the years. Uh, my wife and I have a blended family. We have 9 children, uh, and uh, she is uh, fortunately she does speak German. You taught German at university. So at the feast in 2019, when I inherited the Estonia feast site, I couldn't find a bus. The bus tour said they didn't have an English tour guide. And they said, "Well, what do you have?" And they said, "We have a German tour guide." And I said, "Fine, we'll do it." So we had double translation so that the German-speaking tour guide, then my wife could translate for the rest of the bus. So that was back in 2019. And then I seem to have inherited the feast site a few times since then. So I've known some of you from that. When we were young, we often heard admonitions from our parents. If it was cold or rainy, our mother would say, "Wear your cap or wear your gloves." Or if it was snowy or muddy, wear your overshoes. Well, I grew up on a farm, and my father would tell us before operating the farm equipment, check the oil on the tractor before you use it. Better check the radiator fluid too. And Dad was always insistent on checking the fluid levels on the tractors because failure to do so would ruin the tractor. He never worried about us boys, and I'm one of 4 brothers, not that we wouldn't fill up the tractor with enough gasoline, because it didn't take us long to figure out if we didn't want to walk home from the far end of the field, that we should put gasoline in first. So we always remembered the gas, but he reminded us to use the other fluids. It was a warning, it was an admonition. And of course, it was Dad's way of emphasizing when he said, you can run the tractor without gas, but never run it without oil or other fluids. And so when doing the field work, my dad would say, never turn too short at the end of the field when you're pulling the equipment, because the machine you're pulling could get right up on the tractor wheels and come over on top of you and crush you. So we had a warning. And that got our attention because we didn't want the machine to ride up on the wheels with the piece of tillage equipment and crush us. And every farm kid that I know that's nearly happened to, they had to learn, oops, I've got to be more careful. We were raised with livestock, a dairy farm and a beef farm. And we learned you never approach a horse from the rear, or you surprise a cow from the side, because a horse can kick straight back, but a cow can only kick to the side and generally not straight back. Now, the parents did not issue these warnings because they hated us. They warned us because they loved us. They didn't want anything bad to happen to us. They knew that if we didn't wear cap and gloves in bad weather, we might get sick. And our parents knew that if we weren't careful operating farm equipment, we could get hurt. Now, perhaps when you were a teenager, your parents gave you warnings. When handling the car keys, they might say, be careful when, and so forth. But I know my dad explained to his sons the danger of driving on snow and ice. Now, I was raised in Minnesota, where we had distinct seasons and snow and ice in the winter. And we accounted on a trip that we took, and I currently live in Arkansas near the world headquarters of Walmart. And so we would drive up to Chicago in the wintertime, and there would be snow flurries, but a passing car would zing by us on the freeway, and there would be snow flying everywhere, and would not. Someone from the south did not understand you can't drive the same speed in snowy ground as you do in dry ground. And I told my family, we'll see those cars again soon in the ditch. And sure enough, as we traveled on the freeway, there were cars and trucks that coming from the south to the north that would wind up in the ditch. Now, in the Bible, we have a number of warnings that are issued by our Creator. Jesus mentions these warnings because he loves us. And just like our parents telling us to wear a cap or be careful on the highway, Jesus Christ specifically lists 7 warnings during his 3.5-year ministry. So I'm entitling this message, 7 Warnings from Jesus. And I'm going to try to share a screen now. Seven times, Jesus Christ used a specific warning using the word beware. And then he followed that with an explanation of what we should beware of. If it was important enough for the Creator and Messiah to mention it, it's surely critical for us to understand what he was warning us about. The first thing he warned was in Matthew 7:15. Beware of false prophets. In Matthew 7:15, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. Now, I presume some of you have seen wolves. In my area, we don't have wolves. We have coyotes. They're like wolves. And I happen to raise some sheep. And I've got about a dozen sheep. And if the fences are not secure, the coyote will, they can jump a sheep, they jump a fence, they can jump a 6-foot fence. And so every year I would lose 1 or 2 sheep to the coyote that were coming. So I've learned how to stop that by putting 2 fences up, separating them apart by 3 meters. And they won't jump 2 fences. And so that stopped them. But I had to be very careful of the coyote. Much like a ravenous wolf, they would go for whatever they wanted. And they would, or they might dig under the fence if they thought they could get away with it. In Matthew 7:15, to beware of false prophets, it says, come to you in sheep's clothing. What is that? It means that they are disguised as one of the brethren. They're disguised in such a way that we might be deceived. In Matthew 24, verse 11, in Matthew 24, verse 11, we read, many false prophets shall arise and deceive many. Now, notice it doesn't say a few false prophets, it says many false prophets. And who will they deceive? Many people will be deceived, not just a few people deceived. And I find that, as we know, as we look around people who proclaim Christianity, and that they don't keep the commandments of God. And there are many, there are hundreds of different denominations, but they don't follow the instructions in the Bible. they have become deceived by others, or they become self-deceived. We have the story in Acts 13 in verses 1 through 12, where Paul and Barnabas encountered a false prophet. And there are many examples of this. In Revelation 19:20, we read about the false prophet who deceives. Well, the characteristics of a false prophet in Matthew 24, verse 24, if possible, will deceive the very elect. Well, who are the very elect? Who is Jesus speaking to when he gave this warning? It was to his 12 disciples. And I would say that's probably a pretty good choice for who's the very elect. He's saying, don't let a false prophet deceive you. So we must also be extraordinarily careful not to be deceived, not to be seduced by slander or false statements that on the surface can appear to be true, but we have on our warning that we are to, the first warning was to beware of false prophets. The second warning that Jesus gave to his disciples, and I thought this odd because it took me a little bit to understand, to beware of men in Matthew 10, verse 17. In Matthew 10, verse 17. Beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils and scourge you in their synagogues. Well, the people that he was warning them about would be the people who would betray them, turn on them, even in their own synagogues, and cast judgment against them. These people were not of God, but of their own devices. So he's saying, beware of those people. In Ephesians 4, verses 11 through 14, in Ephesians 4, 11 through 14, and he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. That till verse 13, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Verse 14, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men in the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. So that's the Apostle Paul was warning the Ephesians, as Christ did, to beware of men, the trickery of men, how people could be deceitful, and how people could be confused by tossed about with every wind of doctrine. It was coming their way. They just had to be braced for it. Paul said, the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. There are people that willingly try to deceive others to bring them along. We're in Ephesians. Let's go to Ephesians 5 and verse 6. In Ephesians 5 and verse 6, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. What are empty words? Words that don't speak the truth. Paul wrote also in Colossians in chapter 2 and verse 8. In Colossians 2 and verse 8. Beware, same word that Jesus was using, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. So when Jesus said, beware of men, it's what men dream up, what they look to do, and then they want you to follow their traditions. And of course, we know the traditions uh, uh, have been around a long time. We just look at many of the world's holidays become traditions, and through synchronization, uh, the uh, the uh, church through the years, the ones that have diverged from the Bible, they adopt the pagan holidays, and hence we have the empty words and empty traditions. And so we have to be careful of, man, it's not just what they say, however, we have to be careful of, it's what they do. It was many years ago, I built a small company. I had about a dozen employees. And we were close, only a dozen of us in the company. And every Friday afternoon before they went home, I wished everybody a good weekend. And I would close up and lock up the building. And we often laughed and we joked and we kidded. I kidded around. And one Friday afternoon, I said, well, I'll see everybody on Monday, but don't get hit by a train. Now, I said it in a lighthearted manner. It was kind of a joke because everybody watches out for trains, right? I didn't even have to say it, it would be obvious. That was on Friday. On Monday, I received a telephone call that one of my employees would not be coming to work that day. The young lady was in a group of friends riding in a recreational vehicle, a motorhome, and the vehicle had approached a railroad crossing. The warning lights were flashing, and the driver thought he could make it across the railroad tracks before the approaching train. And the driver was right. The motorhome made it across the tracks just in the nick of time. The front of the train engine barely scraped the back of the motorhome. But unfortunately, the motorhome driver did not take into account that the motorhome was pulling a boat on a trailer. The engine of struck the motorhome between the boat and the trailer and the motorhome. As a result, the motorhome slammed up one side of the train and the boat and trailer slammed up against the other side. And uh, uh, both of those items, the boat and trailer as well as the motorhome, they disintegrated upon impact. Now, and the train didn't stop. It couldn't stop. The momentum dragged it along for the next half mile or so until the engineer could bring the train to a halt. The young lady that worked for me was riding in the motorhome. The motorhome, when it smashed against the train, had a propane fuel tank, and that exploded when, upon impact with the train. And the young lady found herself lying out in a grass field, wondering what happened because it happened so quickly. And she found that while she was relatively unhurt, uh, that other people were hurt in the crash and one person died, all because the driver didn't heed the warning at the railroad crossing. The young lady, my employee, wasn't deceived by words, but she was deceived by actions. She should have been cautious about who she associated with because the consequences could be severe or even fatal. So, number two is the warning that Jesus gave us: beware of men, and that's true whether or not they mean to do you harm. The third warning that Jesus gave is in Matthew 16:6. And the third warning was beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In Matthew 16:6, Jesus said to them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And he repeats that in verse 11, Matthew 16, verse 11. How is it that you do not understand that I spoke not to you concerning bread, but that you should beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He wasn't just speaking about the actual leaven in the actual bread that they were using, but really about their influence, that they could have a false and deceptive influence upon people. But what kind of influence is he talking about? And it becomes more clear when we read Luke 12 in verse 1. In Luke 12 and verse 1, and he explains it in the last part of the verse. Beware you of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So here Jesus is explaining what that leaven is. It's hypocrisy. What's hypocrisy? It's pretending to one thing, but doing something else. In other words, creating the impression of what someone is doing by the appearance of virtue or religion, but then not acting accordingly. So the third warning that Jesus gave was to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In the shortest, don't be like them. Don't say one thing and do another. Be consistent with your actions in Christianity. The fourth warning that Jesus gave was to beware of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. In Matthew 16:12, Jesus said, then they understood that he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. What does he mean by the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Well, this can be explained in Mark 7 and verse 7, when again Jesus was saying, in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Basically, the Pharisees and Sadducees weren't always looking at the Bible. They were making things up as they went along. And they were teaching as if what they taught were doctrines, but in fact, it was commandments of men. And that has been continued now for thousands of years. In Colossians 2 and verse 8, in Colossians 2, verse 8, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. People can be misled, and they can mislead themselves. I know I went to a funeral of a member's family member from a Christian denomination. This particular denomination did not believe in using musical instruments in church. So everything they sang was without accompaniment, no piano, no instruments, because they misread a verse in the Bible. It did not take the Bible as a whole, but rather thought they shouldn't use musical instruments. Apparently, they didn't read the part about David had 400 musicians for the temple, and wrote many psalms. In Colossians 2 and verse 20, and I'll read this in the NIV, New International Version. You have died with Christ and become dead to these old ways. Why do you follow the old ways of worship? Why do you obey man-made rules? And really, that's really the history of mankind and Christianity, is they make up their own rules. Now, during the winter, and I was raised in the North Country, where it gets cold enough and the lakes, ponds and lakes freeze over, and they form a layer of ice on top of the water. Now, there may be warnings on lakes, and they would come on the radio that would announce people should be warning thin ice, to don't walk on frozen ponds or lakes, because looks can be deceptive. The ice might not be thick enough to carry a person's body weight, or he or she could then break through the thin ice and drown. And sometimes, and it happens almost every year, some people do not heed the warning. They go into the frozen lake and pond anyway. Now, I was raised in Minnesota. There are thousands of lakes, and fishing is very common. And my grandmother's cousin was an avid fisherman. He would be on the lake every day of the year if he possibly could. In the winter, he would go ice fishing. He would have a small plywood enclosure uh, about 1.5 meters in each direction, and he would take this little enclosure, put it on the lake, drag it out to a frozen lake. He would drill a hole through the ice, and then he would fish through that hole. And his buddies would come and they would play cards and drink their favorite beverages and wait for the fish to bite. But he couldn't really wait until the ice was thick enough. He would try it every day. And then in the spring, he would want to be on a lake until the very last day when when it was melting. Well, my grandmother's cousin was, and he would take and drive his car onto the lake. And I was just a boy when this happened. And my grandmother's cousin was a large man, and he couldn't walk very well. He used 2 canes to walk. He had bad knees. I never saw him without walking with 2 canes. But he could drive a car, and he drove on the frozen lake. But the ice became thin, and the 4 wheels of the car broke through the ice. And momentarily, the body of the car was only thing holding it up on the ice. The wheels had broken through. And if you've ever gone ice fishing and you know the stories, it only takes a few seconds for the car to sink low enough in the water that the driver couldn't get his door open and he would be trapped by the ice and they would go down with the car. Well, this happened in this car where my grandmother's cousin, he could not open his car door because it was too late. The car was sinking. But he rolled down his window. And despite that he was a large man with 2 bad knees, he crawled out of the window and onto the ice just before the car sunk through the ice and into the lake. And the sight, they said, was something to see. There was a large man flopped out on the ice like a seal in the middle of the ice in the lake, and no car to be seen. It had sunk through the ice. No one could drive a car out to get him, but some folks came out with a sled and dragged him to shore. Now, the lesson was very clear to everyone in our extended family. Take heed to the warning about thin ice. The ice may look secure. You may have driven on that same ice before, but it might not be safe on that day. Well, what's the lesson for us? From time to time, we must ask ourselves if we are on spiritual thin ice. At first glance, we think everything is normal. And you can't tell from looking at a frozen lake just by looking if it's safe to drive on. It's our individual responsibility to check the thickness of the spiritual ice. We must know in our own minds and hearts that we are secure in the knowledge of God and what God expects of us. Now, do we take somebody else's word for it that the ice is thick enough, that the ice will bear our weight? Well, our eternal life depends on our discernment. Are we abiding by the doctrines of God or the commandments of men? And there's a way to do that in Acts 17 and verse 11. Now, in Acts 17, verse 11, even though the people in Berea were hearing from one of the apostles that were sent out They respected the apostle, but in Berea, they said they were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily, whether these things were so. So they said, yes, we believe you, but we want verification. We want to know the truth. We don't want to be misled. So quite simply, we must trust our Bibles. Do not place our trust in those who would take the place of the Pharisees or Sadducees. As we read in Mark 7 and verse 7, the commandments of men are not the doctrines of God. So the fourth warning that Jesus gave was beware of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The fifth warning, beware of the leaven of Herod. Beware of the leaven of Herod. In Mark 8, verse 15, we read, he charged them, saying, meaning Jesus, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, this is an additional warning. You see, Herod had a different law. He wasn't claiming to live by the religious law of the day. He was living by Roman law, which he was charged to enforce. But King Herod, he didn't live by the moral law because he was personally immoral, respecting marriage and murder and so forth. Thus, the leaven of Herod draws attention to the bifurcation or the splitting of the civil or Roman law and the moral law. And nowadays, we know that people consider themselves upstanding people if they've not broken the civil law or the secular law of the land. But their own morality could be unchristian. They're not following God's law. Well, the leaven of Herod involves an exalting of civil law above God's moral law, putting man's law above God's law. Jesus tells us to beware of this. There's a good reason to beware of it. Secularists, those who are only looking at civil law, are very offended by the breach of civil law. And they will bring down the wrath or the force of law against those who offend the secular law. And it happens all the time. For example, if you lie to the police, you can end up in prison. However, secular lies or breaking secular laws, they're very selective. Under the secular law, you cannot lie to the police, but the police can lie to you. They can attempt to deceive you, to trick you into admission, making it look like you've admitted to something. So this reminder of being aware of the leaven of Herod means we must not be confused by the difference between secular law and the moral law. So, reminder number 5, or the warning number 5: beware the leaven of Herod. And then we have warning number 6: beware of the scribes. Well, in Mark 12, verse 38, Jesus made it clear, and he said to them in his doctrine, or in his teaching, beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. Well, we read that similarly in Luke 20 and verse 46, where these scribes, they want the best for themselves. They consider themselves very special, and it doesn't matter who else is in the congregation. They consider themselves better than everyone else. And this goes back to what we read in Matthew 23 and 13. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow others who are entering to go in. They make up their own rules because they and act like they're better than everyone else. So that was in Matthew 23, verse 13. It's repeated in verse 15, Matthew 23, 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For when you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, one convert, and when he is won, you make him twice as much of a son of the grave as yourselves. And he goes down the line. If we read Matthew 23, he repeats over and over again. Verse 24, he calls them blind guides who strain at a net and swallow a camel, creating little rules and obstructions. Verse 25, scribes and Pharisees are hypocrites about cleaning the outside of the cup, but the inside is full of extortion and self-indulgence. He tells them, go ahead and you must clean the inside of the cup, and then the outside will be clean also. Verse 27, about being a woe to the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, like whitewashed tombs, indeed, being beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Full of, verse 28, full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Interesting, they put lawlessness down here when Jesus is teaching this. And we go through this chapter 23, as in verse 31, they're witnesses against themselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. It's that same mindset that rejected the prophets of old. And then in verse 33, serpents, brood of vipers. Satan is often characterized in the Bible as a snake or a serpent. And he's saying this is the same characteristics here that these scribes are doing. So it's a reminder, it's a warning to beware of the scribes. And Matthew 23 is a good chapter to review on that one. Then we've got the seventh warning. Beware of covetousness. Beware of covetousness in Luke 12 and verse 15. And he said to them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. And you know, it's strange. People really identify themselves with their possessions. And there's an old saying that says, the one who dies with the most toys wins. Well, those are people that accumulate things for themselves. And they will do everything to protect their things rather than look to how their behavior is, how they act. We've probably all seen a sign that may have said, beware of dog. And what's the first thing you think of when you see a sign that says, beware of dog? You think of a big mean dog that was likely to bite you or maul you, right? Well, many of us have a ferocious dog story that we might be able to tell each other where we're either attacked or threatened by a dog. And in automotive junkyards or recycling yards, people will try to steal car parts. And so they will come into the junkyard at night and try to steal parts, and even with a fence around it. So what do junkyard owners do? They put a guard dog in with the junk cars. And if you see the sign that says beware of dog, it's a warning to a potential thief that it's not a good idea to come in because the business is closed for the day. You could get hurt by the guard dog. And then there are those who have a sign that says, Don't worry about the dog, worry about the owner. Well, the message is clear: don't trespass, or there will be unpleasant consequences. So take your pick. You get to challenge the vicious dog or the angry owner. Well, covetousness, as we read here, is indeed idolatry. Let's see if I have that one. We look in Colossians 3 in verse 5. Therefore, put to death your members which are on earth: fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil doing, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Putting other things between us and the expectations of obeying God. We can't let things get in the way. Because we wouldn't consider worshiping an idol, and yet wanting other people's stuff uh, is the same as worshiping an idol. It it blocks our relationship with God by being uh, covetous. Now, are these warnings by Jesus any less important than the warnings about icy roads or avoiding vicious dogs or being careful about the flashing railroad lights, crossing lights? Are these warnings any more important than the reports of thin ice on a frozen lake? Or what about not wearing gloves or caps in a cold weather? Or warning about not running out of gas? Or maybe ignoring the car's warning lights on the dashboard? These important warnings, while important, exist for our benefit. But it's the same is true with the warnings that Jesus gives us in the Gospels. He tells us, beware of false prophets, beware of men and what they can do, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the teachings that they have that can creep into our lives and grow and replace what God teaches. Number 4, beware the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. In other words, don't go with the commandments of men, go with the doctrines outlined by God. And warning 5, beware of the leaven of Herod. Don't place the civil or secular law at a higher place than the laws of God. Number 6, beware of the scribes. Don't place ourselves above other people or think that we're somebody special. God doesn't show partiality. And number 7, beware of covetousness. That's important that we not put other things in place of worshiping God. So 7 times Jesus uttered the term beware. And then he followed that with an explanation of what we should beware of. If the warnings were important enough for the Creator and Messiah to mention it, then it's critical for us to understand what he was warning us about. It's just as a sign of us walking on thin ice, we should be mindful of the warnings issued by Jesus.